Good morning. I think one of the hottest topics in the AI world is whether or not our enterprises can get access to the data that AI needs to be relevant, right? And I really appreciate the comments from our last speaker around standards-based and API first, and I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into that. In fact, I would go so far as to argue what our last speaker outlined for you is what I will call a data mesh architecture, which is what we at Elastic believe one needs to deploy in order to get the goodness out of your data. So what does data mesh look like? Well, and why do we have it? So fundamentally, data has gravity. And again, really appreciate Lisa putting up the Artemis mission. I was going to use an Artemis analogy here, so bear with me, because I'm a data nerd, so I got to bring a little NASA nerd stuff in too, right? When you think about data having gravity, it's not like the little gravity well around our moon where we can slingshot, in and out of it really quickly. When you have petabytes and petabytes of data sitting inside of large data stores, there are ingress fees and egress fees, right? It's like having a toll keeper at each one of these data points. And as we amass more and more data, our challenge is getting value out, right? So what about the SaaSpocalypse? Everybody keeps saying AI is going to eat software, and software is going to go away. Enterprise, software is not going to exist in 5 years. Well, I think, to paraphrase that old saying, rumors of our death are greatly exaggerated here in the software industry. And why is that, right? Fundamentally, I'd like to present to you a model to think about AI in that has 4 layers, right? The foundational layer, nobody's going to argue is going away quickly, right? We're all talking about building data centers and even building nuclear power plants to power those data centers. There are so many of them, right? So I don't think anybody's going to argue that AWS, Google, you name the hyperscaler, right? And there are many competitive startups in the AI-specific space. They're at that foundational layer. Right? And that's where the frontier models are running. That's where the AI capabilities exist. Right above that layer, we would argue, is the layer where you need a data mesh, right? And that is that deep and broad intersection between your individual data silos and the capability sets that are in the foundational layer. Above that is a layer where, I think it's beyond hype and hyperbole, there is a potential for disruption. Right? Earlier, the CIO and CDAO from labor mentioned that vibe coding is a thing, right? And this is where the rumors of the SaaSpocalypse are maybe not overly exaggerated, right? It has historically been incredibly difficult to get value out of deeply customized horizontal functionality, right? Things like your HR system, your customer relationship management system, et cetera. Right? It's taken very expensive consulting and very expensive customization to get the data out that you want and to build those repositories for the data that's valuable to your mission. Well, we're finding across industry that is now something that can be disrupted very, very quickly through vibe coding, right? Through AI-assisted software development. And then at the highest level, there are user applications, right? And we all have our favorites, whether it's Instagram and social media, or it's something that actually brings productivity to your day rather than doom scrolling, right? Those applications are going to be transient, as they always have been. In any given year, there's going to be a hot app, right? But what we really believe is that AI memory bank, that data mesh layer, is going to become the most mission-critical asset for enterprises to deploy. Right? And again, our previous speaker mentioned APIs. This is the place where API-first access is going to be incredibly important. And standards, as well as consistency in identity and access management, auditing, and accountability are going to be the most critical function that layer provides. Think of it like this. If data has gravity, and pick your analogy if you're into Star Wars or Star Trek. I don't want to start a religious argument between the Trekkies and the Star Wars crowd, but whether it's your hyperdrive or your warp drive, you've got to find a way to bridge those silos, right? And at Elastic, again, we believe that a data mesh is the way one does that. And I'm going to give you an example of this in operation today. The CISA Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program, CDM, struggled for a number of years to get off the ground because they didn't have a data mesh in place. They went with a solution to try to connect the Security Information and Event Management Systems, or SIEMs, across all of the CFO Act agencies and the smaller civilian federal agencies, right? Over a number of years, they evolved the technology, and they eventually partnered with ECS Federal, who's the prime contractor on the data layer of the CDM contract, and deployed a data mesh. And by doing so, deploying consistent APIs, consistent access standards, consistent audit and accountability, they built that hyperdrive between the data silos in those agencies. So agencies didn't have to move all of their data into a big data lake to get value, right? Today, when there's a vulnerability that's published, and I used the SharePoint example from this past fall, right? CISA is able, using what they call the federal dashboard, to query all of those different security data lakes in their agencies and bring back consolidated vulnerability analysis in minutes, rather than having to go out and do individual data calls to each of those agencies, right? They don't have to dig into each gravity well. They've got that data mesh built. Now you might be saying, Sean, what does that have to do with AI, right? Well, what we believe is that when you deploy a data mesh environment, you are setting the foundation for agentic AI, right? You are building the capability set to go beyond traditional data lakes and bring context and relevance into your mission environment. So I'll give you a really quick example of why this might be interesting, right? So think about e-commerce for a second. If you are interested in oranges, and I mean fresh oranges, right? You want to know if your grocery store has oranges, and you type the simple search, hey, where can I find oranges, right? In traditional keyword-based search, in traditional data silos, we might get back an orange sweater as a result, right? We might get back an orange handbag, we might get back an orange wallet, right? The list goes on. But context is key. And so as we move into this agentic world, we're in a place where the data mesh itself can be a provider of context to your mission-critical applications. By having a search platform that touches through standards-based APIs and with all the role-based access control that we expect out of a properly developed enterprise system, we don't have to worry about, do we have data in the right taxonomy, right? Do we have data in the right lexicon? The agents that are being deployed today, LLMs are particularly good at solving the lexicon and data mismatch problems that we've had in the past, right? So I'm not saying you won't ever need a data dictionary. Again, if you're a data nerd out there, right, you might be thinking, what's happening to my master data manager, right? What's happening to my ontology? We still need those things, right? In medical, for example, right? It is incredibly important that we are very precise in our lexicon. But in e-commerce, and back to the example that Lisa from Salesforce gave of filling out a permit or an application, maybe not as much, right? And so what's important is that we are bringing our data to the AI rather than trying to bring all of our data into a data lake. And again, we would posit that a way to do that is through a data mesh architecture where we can still get the benefit from our legacy data lakes, which are going to be very, very important for certain types of data silos, right? Structured data, historical financial data, things like that. Yeah, we're not advocating move them. But what we think is that from an agentic perspective, agencies need to enable a capability to search and manage their data using things like semantic similarity and natural language where the data lives. So back to that CISA example that I was giving, we have the capability to power the agentic SOC across the federal government. Moving forward in the next 12 to 18 months, CISA has that capability today because they've deployed a data mesh architecture that will allow them to stay ahead of the adversary and allow them to get to the data where it lives rather than trying to centralize it all. So last thing I'd leave you with is I think this is actually the path forward for AI governance, right? Putting in place the same controls that we've used from a zero trust and audit perspective as an industry, the things that have been developed over the last 3 to 4 years from a zero trust architecture perspective, give us the ability to manage disclosure, give us the ability to manage things like identity and credential management, and give us the capabilities to make sure that AI doesn't run amok amongst our data. That's all the time I've got for you today. Thank you.